There may be protests on the outside, but on the inside, progress is being made in terms of pushing through several bits of legislation that are worrying critics. Bring us up to speed on the latest.
I love the example that they use of comparing this to almost a balancing act and a scale, because the minute you have one side of that scale tilting, the other side ends up tilting as well. And that is exactly what we're seeing at the moment in terms of every time one of these judicial reforms gets passed or gets cleared in the Knesset plenum, the same thing happens in terms of the increasement, or at least the more of mass protests end up taking to the streets. And we saw that now with some of the visuals that we saw this morning, even out in the murky weather and the rain. We saw protesters chaining themselves as a way of saying, or at least crying out, that this, at least to them, may be an illegitimate move by a legitimately voted in government. From the government's perspective, this is something that was cleared at least very early in the morning on Tuesday morning, although the opposition did boycott the votes and also tried to put in filibusters to delay the vote. We're looking at a situation where, as you mentioned, the government is now going to have near total power. The checks and balances system that allows the Supreme Court to sort of put a break and take a minute back and say, wait a minute, perhaps that this is a law that may infringe on people's rights. Perhaps this is a law that may override a basic law. That is no longer going to happen if this bill, and it is very important to mention this, if the bill passes the second and the third reading. At the moment, yes, there is a major step in the fact that it has passed the first reading, but in order for something to become a law in Israel, the legislation or the bill has to go through 3 readings. And it is likely that the same thing is going to happen from the opposition point of view, that they will put in filibusters, they will increase the protest, they will try and sort of derail this process. From the coalition's point of view, they very much want to see this being passed before the deadline that they were given, which is Passover, which happens in 3 weeks' time.
But is there time in the meantime for this compromise to be reached? We heard President Isaac Herzog there saying this internal struggle is, quote, tearing us apart. Is there a gap for some kind of middle ground before the second and third reading?
I so badly want to be the voice of optimism to say that, yes, there is a middle ground that can be reached. I think that we are far surpassed that. And I think that because of the fact that the opposition and the coalition, and I'm talking about the main heads here, the figures that we're seeing in power, are constantly turning around and saying that unless there are preconditions put forward, we are not going to be sitting at a table to compromise. The coalition saying our door is always open, but we are going ahead with judicial reform. The opposition saying if this is the very thing we're fighting, you should be putting this on hold so that we can sit and come to a compromise. Isaac Herzog very much trying to be in the middle and balance the two sides. The truth is that where we are at the moment, there is very little room to compromise because of the fact that there is a deadline looming, because of the fact that both sides seem to be at an impasse over the fact that there are preconditions. And what I think is very interesting now is that we are starting to see bipartisan figures coming out and saying, okay, this perhaps is tearing the country apart. Maybe there does need to be some room to sort of calm down and level it out. I think, however, that the time for that has passed, but it doesn't mean that efforts being put in that way are not going to continue going forward.
Meanwhile, in another development, police opening an investigation into Zvika Fogel over comments that were made around what happened in Hawara when settlers went on the rampage. Bring us up to speed on the implications here.
I think what's so damaging about Zvika Fogel, we have to remember, firstly, he's part of the Otzma Yehudit party, that is the Jewish power party that is under Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister. Exactly. These comments were not made before or during, they were made after the riots. And I think that's really the key point here. The comments were made as such that if the army is not going to take matters into their hands and actually apprehend or go into these towns and have some kind of a revenge tactic, then we can be able to do that. And if the IDF's not going to do their job, citizens should be able to do so. This is a very much do as I say and not as I do. But in this case, politicians have to draw the line of being held accountable for their behavior as well as their words.